Friends, welcome back. We are on session 12 of Advent of Divine Justice. And I guess go ahead and take it away, Hassan.
Well, thank you.
I'm sorry. No.
You.
Let me pull up the screen share, and then we can start with a prayer, and we'll go from there. Does everyone see my screen? Oh my God, thou seest me in my lowliness and weakness, occupied with the greatest undertaking, determined to raise thy word among the masses and to spread thy teachings among thy peoples. How can I succeed unless thou assist me with the breath of the Holy Spirit? Help me to triumph by the host of thy glorious kingdom, and shower upon me thy confirmations, which alone can change a gnat into an eagle, a drop of water into rivers and seas, and an atom into lights and suns. O my Lord, assist me with thy triumphant and effective might, so that my tongue may utter thy praises and attributes among all people, and my soul overflow with the wine of thy love and knowledge. Thou art the omnipotent and the doer of whatsoever thou willest.
All right. Thank you very much, Jeremiah.
Thank you, Hassan.
And welcome back. So happy to be back. This is going to be another exciting session. If you recall, in our previous sessions, we went through America and the Most Great Peace to capture that 40-year history from 1893 to 1933. So that was because we had initially read the first paragraph of paragraph 16, that the paragraph 16 starts off. So now we're going to get into paragraph 16 and really study it in our session today. So let us get into it. This is the Advent of Divine Justice we're studying, written by the beloved guardian, Shoghi Effendi. And this is the main themes that come in paragraph 16. The beloved guardian addresses the onward march of the cause, obstacles, as well as defections of prominent Bahá'ís. The beloved guardian mentions the ministry of Abdul Baha, the ministry of the beloved guardian. He also mentions these three vices that face the American Baha'i community: corruption, moral laxity, and ingrained prejudice. And for all the students of this class, I want you to remember these three: corruption, moral laxity, and ingrained prejudice, because the beloved guardian later on in the Advent of Divine Justice presents his weapons to take on these three vices that are afflicting the American Baha'i community and the community at large. So I want you to remember these, okay? So let us have our reader. Miss Sandra, are you with us? Could you read this paragraph?
I'm on an iPad. This is just too small for me to see.
Okay, no worries, Miss Sandra. Thank you so much. Scott,
sorry.
you? No, don't mention it, Miss Sandra. Always good. Scott, could you read this one?
Yes, I can.
Okay, excellent. Go for it.
Okay. A community relatively negligible in its numerical strength, separated by vast distances from both the focal center of its faith and the land wherein the preponderating mass of its fellow believers reside, bereft in the main of material resources and lacking in experience and in prominence, ignorant of the beliefs, concepts, and habits of those peoples and races from which its spiritual founders have sprung, wholly unfamiliar with the languages in which its sacred books were originally revealed, constrained to place its sole reliance upon an inadequate rendering of only a fragmentary portion of the literature embodying its laws, its tenets, and its history, subjected from its infancy to tests of extreme severity, involving at times the defection of some of its most prominent members, having to contend ever since its inception and in an ever increasing measure with the forces of corruption, of moral laxity, and ingrained prejudice. Such a community, in less than half a century and unaided by any of its sister communities, whether in the East or in the West, has, by the virtue of celestial potency with which an all-loving master has abundantly endowed it, lent an impetus to the onward march of the cause it has espoused, which the combined achievements of its co-religionists in the West have failed to rival.
Excellently read, Scott. Thank you so much. So after reading America and the Most Great Peace together in our past sessions, you can see in this paragraph how the beloved guardian is highlighting from the period from 1893, and so this is written 1938, so this is 45 years after the first intimation by Reverend Jessup. So this is a community that is relatively negligible in size. It's not a large community. It's not in numerical strength. It is faced with innumerable challenges, as mentioned here. It is distant from the preponderating mass of its fellow believers. Its resources, it doesn't have much resources, bereft of the main of material resources. The early American Baha'i community lacking in experience and prominence, ignorant of the beliefs, concepts, habits of those peoples and races from which its spiritual founders have sprung. They didn't have the books and resources in their own language. So it says, wholly unfamiliar with the languages in which its sacred books were originally revealed, constrained to a place its sole reliance upon an inadequate rendering of only a fragmentary portion of the literature, embodying its laws, its tenets, and its history. Subjected from its infancy to tests of extreme severity. So all of this period, 1893 to 1903, you can remember, this was when the faith was emerging in America, when we read in America and the Most Great Peace. The 1903 to 1913, that second decade that the beloved guardian mentioned, was a period of extreme tests. And we're going to explore this here in Advent to Divine Justice. So it was tests of extreme severity, involving at times the defection of some of its most prominent members. And we're going to explore that also here in this presentation in Advent. We talked about it in our previous discourse when we were talking about America and the Most Great Peace. So this also occurred, causing an extreme challenge to these early American friends, and having to contend ever since its inception and in an ever-increasing measure with the forces of corruption, moral laxity, and ingrained prejudices. Now, it's interesting here, dear friends, the word here is forces. Okay, now this comes up again, the dark forces. See, these are just a few of the dark forces, namely corruption, moral laxity, ingrained prejudice. These are just some of the dark forces that we have to be on guard. And the beloved guardian in Advent to Divine Justice, this is his spiritual manual for doing action. Okay, so this is his spiritual manual for action. Okay, now another great letter he wrote in 1934 is called Dispensation of Baha'u'llah. And I'm just want you to understand for 2 seconds what that one is, And why I'm bringing that up is because that is his letter of being. Okay? Being, meaning belief, the fundamentals of the faith. So if you say, I am a Baha'i, what does it mean to believe? What does it stand for? So belief, the fundamentals of the faith. Who is the beloved Bab? Who is Baha'u'llah? Who is Abdul Baha? What is this administrative order? So now Advent to Divine Justice is the doing, the applique of what this faith stands for, in the sense of how the transformation of the inner life and the external conditions. So one is being, one is doing, right? But they're all intertwined. They're not separate. You follow? So this is, one is, if you say I'm a Baha'i and I am the being, you have to accept dispensation of Baha'u'llah, right? Because that's the being. And the applique is the transformation of the inner life as well as the external conditions. And this comes in Advent. So this is very interesting that we're going to be getting into this. So in this pivotal paragraph, paragraph 16 here, the beloved guardian is directly mentioning the struggles, the challenges, the tests that face this early American Baha'i community. But at the end, how cool is this? And we mentioned this in American the Most Great Peace. In less than a half century, unaided by any of its sister communities, whether in the East or in the West, has by virtue of the celestial potency with which an all-loving master has abundantly endowed it, lent an impetus to the onward march of the cause. It has espoused which the combined achievements of its co-religionists in the West have failed to rival. So no matter all these challenges, these great hurdles, these obstacles that this early American Baha'i community had to face, this American Baha'i community, unaided, championed these obstacles and also through the blessing of His Holiness Abdul Baha, walking up and down this great country for 239 days, blessing this and infusing and injecting that energies into this American Baha'i community, has infinitely blessed it and abundantly endowed it with these capacities to really to lend this massive impetus in the onward march of the cause in the American Baha'i community. So this is really an incredible paragraph that we're going to explore here today. So just to recap, this is, as I always do this brief recaps. Here, the beloved guardian, he is praising the achievements of the North American Baha'is, despite the obstacles it has faced since its birth. And in this section, we will study the origin and the birth of the North American Baha'i community. Next, we're going to explore the defection of prominent Baha'is. This was mentioned here by the beloved guardian, defection of prominent Baha'is, as one of the challenges. And then finally, we were going to explore those three forces of corruption, moral laxity, and ingrained prejudice that the North American Baha'i community has had to battle since its inception, okay? So this is what we're going to be exploring in this section. Some key points that I want you to remember as we're going through this section. The Baha'i faith was introduced in the United States when two Baha'is from what is now Lebanon, Anton Haddad and Dr. Ibrahim Khairullah, moved to New York in 1892 to find work. The classes that Dr. Ibrahim Khairullah started in Chicago to teach the faith in 1895 attracted a significant number of souls. And after visiting Abdul Baha in 1898, some of the believers realized that the curriculum taught by Dr. Khairullah was not a true representation of the Baha'i scriptures. So after that historic pilgrimage, some of the American believers realized what Dr. Khairullah was teaching was not what Abdul Baha was saying. So this was a dramatic moment. In 1900, Dr. Khairallah decided to break away from Abdul Baha and to start his own sect in collaboration with Mirza Muhammad Ali. Ahmad Sohrab and Mrs. Julia Lynch Chandler, they set up the New History Society in New York in 1929 and confronted the American National Spiritual Assembly, and as a result were expelled from the Baha'i community. Corruption is the use of power by people in authority for illegitimate personal gain, either for private enrichment or to stay in power. Corruption in America is systematic and endemic. It influences the American system of government, the operation of corporations, and business and trade relationships. The dramatic changes that occurred in the United States after World War I undermined the role of Christianity in society and its moral influence on people. And there is strong evidence indicating that racial prejudice is deeply entrenched in American society and in the minds of many of its citizens. So the term that the beloved guardian here mentions right here is ingrained prejudice. Ingrained, I mean, it's so part and natural of the fibers. It's deep. It's ingrained. It's part and parcel of the system. And so here, the beloved guardian mentioning the word ingrained prejudice. That's why it's so entrenched in American society, the minds of many of its citizens. So now let us get into these paragraphs. Well, technically paragraph, but we're studying it deeply, really deeply in this section. In paragraph 16, the beloved guardian, Shoghi Effendi, highlights the significant advances made by the North American Baha'i community over the previous 50 years, in spite of the many obstacles and challenges that they have had to overcome. Their progress has exceeded the combined achievements of all the other Baha'i communities in the West. So this is an incredible laurel, as they say, that this American Baha'i community has achieved at this point in time. The beloved guardian, Shoghi Effendi, identifies the following obstacles faced by this community. And we read about this also in America, the Most Great Peace, these challenges. And that was really from the period of 1903 to 1913, these challenges that this community had to face. Insignificant number of believers, geographically remote from Persia, the birthplace of the faith and the Holy Land, its focal center, lack of material resources, experience, prominence. Unfamiliar with Arabic and Farsi, the languages in which the sacred books were originally revealed, and relying only on a fragment of literature providing the laws, tenets, and history of the faith. Experiencing severe spiritual tests from the early days to the defection of some of its most prominent members, and having to contend with the negative forces of corruption, moral laxity, and prejudice dominating the wider community. So these, dear friends, were just some of the massive hurdles that this community were faced with. So let's explore this from this very start. The introduction of the Baha'i faith in the United States had a very humble start. In 1892, two Baha'is of Christian background from a region that today is Lebanon, Anton Haddad, there's a picture of him, and Dr. Ibrahim Khairallah traveled to New York to find work. Now, there's an incredible article in World Order, the World Order magazine, written by Dr. Robert Stockman. and he outlines the history of the early American Baha'i community. And he is a foremost scholar, and I encourage you to read all his works. In it, he studies the history of the early American Baha'i community, and he also, in that article in World Order, he mentions that this appellation, doctor, was a title that Ibrahim Khairallah gave to himself. It was a made-up title of doctor. So when I say Dr. Ibrahim Khairallah, I'm just going off what the books and articles I read, but he truly wasn't a doctor of really anything in that sense. So he traveled to New York to find work. And this Dr. Khairallah had become a Baha'i in Cairo and had received the tablet from Baha'u'llah. He had also been in communication with Abdul Baha. So then this incredible occasion occurred on September 23rd, 1893. This was in Chicago. It became the site of the first public mention of the Baha'i faith in America. It was at the World's Parliament of Religions held in Chicago in connection with the World's Columbian Exposition. The Baha'i faith was mentioned for the first time in the West. It was a paper written by the Reverend Henry H. Jessup, who was serving in Syria. And he quoted the words spoken by Baha'u'llah in 1890 to the Orientalist, Edward Granville Brown, that gave utterance to sentiments so noble, so Christ-like, that we repeat them as our closing words. And this is the words: that all nations should become one in faith and all men as brothers, that the bond of affection and unity between the sons of men should be strengthened, that diversity of religions should cease and differences of race be annulled. What harm is there in this? Yet so it shall be. These fruitless strifes, these ruinous wars shall pass away, and the most great peace shall come. Do not you in Europe need this also? Let not a man glory in this, that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind. So here, Reverend Henry H. Jessup was quoting the words of Baha'u'llah that were revealed to Edward Granville Brown in 1890. And this is the first mention of the Baha'i faith in the United States on September 23rd, 1893. So this was an incredible historic occasion. And this is the World's Columbian Exposition in Jackson Park, Chicago, 1893. And I believe there's only one of these buildings standing left. All of them were taken down over the years. And in the center, you can see the Statue of the Republic stands guard over this great basin. This is an incredible occasion. So this was the Reverend Henry Jessup. And if you recall, later on, he became quite opposed to the faith. This was just by happenstance that he was the vehicle, per se, for the first intimation of the faith. He was, and we read about that in American, The Most Great Peace. On September 23rd, 1893, Reverend Henry Jessup, this was a Presbyterian missionary living in Syria, delivered a paper at the Parliament about his experiences in the Middle East and describing Baha'u'llah and the Baha'i faith that was read at a conference session. And this is where it was published. So right the day after it was published, this is the article, Sunday, September 24th, 1893. This is the publication, the Inter-Ocean, Chicago, Illinois. And it says, in the palace of Bahji, I like that, or Delight, just outside the fortress of Acre on the Syrian coast, there died a few months since a famous Persian sage, the Babi saint named Baha'u'llah, the glory of God, the head of that vast reform party of Persian Muslims who accept the New Testament as the Word of God and Christ as the deliverer of men, who regard all nations as one and all men as brothers. 3 years ago, he was visited by a Cambridge scholar and gave utterance to sentiments so noble, so Christ-like, that we repeat them as our closing words. And we just read that. And at the end, it says, do not you in Europe need this also? Let not a man glory in this, that he loves his country. Let him rather glory in this, that he loves his kind. So this was published in the Inter-Ocean, Chicago, Illinois, Sunday, September 24th, 1893. So this is the first mention of the faith, not only spoken aloud, but in publication. Okay, so then 1894, Haddad went back to Europe. Anton Haddad, he went back to Europe to participate in the Antwerp International Art Fair. And then he returned to Syria. So this is the picture on the right. This is the Antwerp Universal Exhibition 1894 that Anton Haddad went to. And you can see the location, that's the site for it in Antwerp. And then he went back to Syria. But Dr. Ibrahim Khairallah decided to settle down in Chicago and earn a living as a spiritual healer. He also started some classes to teach the Baha'i faith to Americans. At that time, the Baha'i scriptures were not available in English. So he started coming up with the idea of spiritual healing. And so that's what he proceeded to do. Now, Dr. Khairallah was not fully aware of the Baha'i social teachings and the fundamental verities of the faith. Hence, he devised a curriculum based on his skill of spiritual healing, biblical prophecies referring to Baha'u'llah, and his impression of the teachings and fundamentals of the faith. The classes proved quite popular and attracted many people. It's also important to note he was very charismatic. So because of his charisma, it was one of the reasons that he was attracting people, not per se because of his so-called made up ideas that he was really injecting into what he called the Baha'i faith. It was really due to his charisma. So the classes proved quite popular and attracted many people. And within 2 years, from 1893, within 2 years from that point, Dr. Khairallah was informing Abdul Baha about his remarkable success. So in 1895, Khairallah started weekly classes teaching the faith in Kenosha. And as you all have recalled, Kenosha is one of the first Baha'i communities. And by 1896, there were hundreds of believers in Chicago. So this is only, dear friends, 3 years after the first intimation by Reverend Henry Jessup. Now there are hundreds of believers in Chicago and Kenosha. And in 1897, he visited Kansas City, New York City, Ithaca, and Philadelphia, attracting significant number of souls. The beloved guardian names the most prominent among those who were converted to the faith in that period as the stout-hearted Thornton Chase, surnamed Sawbet. This is steadfast. This is Mr. Thornton Chase, by His Holiness Abdul Baha, and designated by him as the first American believer who became a convert to the faith in 1894. The immortal Louisa A. Moore, the mother teacher of the West, surnamed Leva, Banner by Abdul Baha, and Dr. Edward Getzinger, to whom she was later married, Howard McNaught, Arthur P. Dodge, Isabella Brittingham, Lillian Capps, Paul Dealey, Chester Thatcher, and Helen S. Goodall. These souls, dear friends, we mentioned some of these in our American, the Most Great Peace and Studies. These are the disciples of Abdul Baha. Many of them are. I mean, Paul Deely was the first Baha'i to enter into the South and is mentioned by the Beloved Guardian. Isabella Brittingham is also a disciple of Abdul Baha. So these are Helen S. Goodall, disciple of Abdul Baha. Howard McNutt, disciple of Abdul Baha. So these are souls that, and obviously Thornton Chase, first American Baha'i. So these are incredible, incredible, incredible souls during this period that he, through his classes, he was attracting very pure individuals. And these are the first 18 Baha'is in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So these are incredible souls. And this is Mr. Byron Tuck. He's per se the bubble of this community, the gate of that Kenosha. I would call him Bubble Kenosha, because he literally opened that community in the sense. Khairullah completed his first lessons on the 1st of January, 1898, and brought into being the third Baha'i group in North America. This is Byron Lane, the first Baha'i in Kenosha, and he's seated in the center right there. So that's Mr. Byron Lane. So incredible community, Kenosha. What a history. And we're also going to find out that this community faced, per se, the first attacks in print ever because of the growth of that community. What happened, we're going to explore that coming up, that the Christians saw the growth of this community and they started collaborating, and they actually went and hired someone to write in print to attack the Baha'i community. Never has that happened before in any other place in America, in history of America, apart from Kenosha. And it's because the community per se was reaching out of the emergence of obscurity. And now it was becoming per se a threat. And so this was the community that the faith was started to really grow. So the three different congregations went and hired someone to go start writing articles to attack the faith. So this, in 1899, the size of the American Baha'i community had reached 1,500. So 6 years after Reverend Henry Jessup, his intimation, had now reached 1,500. Various Baha'i communities emerged: Chicago, New York, Kenosha, which is Kenosha, Wisconsin, Cincinnati, northern New Jersey, Philadelphia, and Racine. So these, you could see how this little community, negligible in size, is now starting to grow organically through these classes that Ibrahim Khairullah has been giving. And so this community is starting to slowly, organically flourish. But also the Greater Society started noticing this community. So this is an article, 16th April, 1899, Chicago Tribune. Chicago followers of strange religions. So as you see, 1899, now the Greater Society is starting to notice this community because of its emergence. Remember that this Khairullah had mixed up a lot of his ideas, his ideology, his spiritual healing and distortions, and mixed that up with what he understood was the Baha'i faith, because a lot of it had not at this point been translated. So he made up a lot of things. So all of his ideology seemed strange. Rightly so, it was strange. So this is what it was in print, and I find it interesting, so I put it here in this presentation. It says, the queerest of all the queer religions, which have taken root in Chicago, certainly the most mysterious of them all, is characterized by its followers as Bab-e-Din, or the door of true religion. And Ibrahim G. Khairullah, a man of Assyrian birth but Egyptian rearing, is at its head. While professing to be an esoteric Christian and to teach the real religion of Christ, Khairullah openly declares a large part of the Gospels to be spurious, and at the same time maintains that there is no evolution, only involution. Moralities, he further declares in the above-mentioned pamphlet, are not spiritual duties, and there are no miracles as commonly understood. And so this is more on that is in the publication. We don't have to read word for word, but this is was in the article, but it mentions, and it's a little hard to read for the friends, but I'll just mention a few things here. With statements like these, the Bab-ed-Din, the mind of the receptive and devout student, is somewhat prepared that one of the secret doctrines, secret doctrines and articles of the faith, which has become known to many Chicago people as one of the tenets of the Bab-ed-Din religion. God in the first person, according to these teachings, has long been dead. Ibrahim Khairullah has now gone back to Egypt to assist in bringing God in the second person, or Jesus Christ, back to Chicago to reign, and God in the third person will initially be killed in this city. Strange, strange. Other statements and teachings fully as startling and shocking to Orthodox Christians as these are said to be poured forth for the benefit of Bab-ed-Din initiates, but not until the loyalty and silence of the pupil are pretty well assured is he allowed to participate in a knowledge of these mysteries, and even then under pain of great and mysterious penalties should any secret of the order be divulged. The religious faith of this order is divided into two parts. So he created two groups, Allah and El-Feza. And of it, and himself the leader of the Bab-ed-Din declares in print. So he made himself the leader of one of these groups and Abdul Baha the leader of the other one. It was at Cairo to Egypt, where I lived 21 years, that I first met my master, Abd Karim Effendi. This is the one who taught him the faith, who eventually instructed me in the faith and guided me to the headquarters of this holy order, for he is the wisest man in Egypt. He still resides at Cairo. From the Orient, this leader further says, whence is every teacher and prophet has appeared, I have been sent to teach that religion to the people of the country. Interestingly, this article mentions its followers now number about 50 million, scattered all over the earth. There being no country in which some of its believers cannot be found, it has taken root and is rapidly spreading in India, China, Japan, Turkey, Persia, Russia, England, France, Germany, and even in the heart of Africa. And in Chicago, the Bab-ed-Din followers are said to be number about 300. And the large house on the west side is used as a sort of temple or gathering place for the numerous classes and private students who every day flock thither. Far into the night, upon certain occasion, groups of them from 10 to 50 students meet and work together. For all of this instruction, no money is paid, the organization being maintained entirely by subscription, it is said. So you can see that the work of Ibrahim Khairullah is attracting a lot of people, but what he is saying and distorting of the faith has made it into a cult. And so the general society in the articles, you can see how the secret doctrines and the distortions that are mentioned. I didn't pull his writings because obviously he's a covenant breaker and we don't want to put his writings in here, but I pulled from what the general society's views and understandings of what he was saying. So that's why I did it like this. Also, it says, no true teaching can be given for money, say the followers of the Bab-ed-Din religion, and only true seekers and not the masses are taught, is the dictum of its leader. The limited and quasi-secret character of the organization is the element which attracts hundreds of curious individuals to it monthly, and it is the element upon which Khairullah, who with his wife is now in Egypt, most confidently depends. To this end, strange rites, initiations, and ceremonies are practiced, and an atmosphere of semi-spiritual mystery maintained in regard to the whole affair. The secret doctrines of Jesus, it is claimed by the Baha'u'ddin students, are preserved intact in the book of Revelation, but the inspired origin and truthfulness of much of the New Testament is questioned, and unless the secret teaching which the head of this peculiar organization gives is shared in no part of the Bible or of Christianity, can be properly understood. When Ibrahim Khairullah returns from his Egyptian pilgrimage, he will bring great and new truths back with him. The organization and its home are in the meantime kept up and maintained by his most devoted followers. So this, he was just about to go on pilgrimage. That's what it's saying. He is going on pilgrimage to meet with Abdul Baha. And that historic pilgrimage, as you all remember, he went with this lady, Miss Lua Getzinger. So we're going to, let's continue. So this was, you can see how much distortion and how he created this message from Abdul Baha to be a cult. In paragraph 16, the beloved guardian refers to the defection of its most prominent members as one of the challenges that the North American Baha'i community had to deal with. And these defections occurred during both the ministries of Abdul Baha and the beloved guardian, Shoghi Effendi. So one of the major incidences that resulted in the defection of some of the prominent Baha'is, that was this rebellion of Dr. Khairullah in the time of Abdul Baha. In 1898, Mrs. Phoebe Hurst, who had been introduced to the faith by Mrs. Lua Getzinger, had plans to visit Abdul Baha in the Holy Land. So if you recall these historic pilgrimages from that was in the first decade, 1893 to 1903. This was the period of the historic pilgrimages. That was the highlight that the beloved guardian mentioned as the first decade. So this was an incredible period of, and it was highlighted by these historic pilgrimages. So let's go and see this pilgrimage. So Mrs. Lua Getzinger invited other believers to join her. The invitation attracted a number of people, including Dr. and Mrs. Getzinger, Dr. Khairullah and his wife, May Ellis Bowles, Miss Pearson, Ann Apperson, Mrs. Thornborough and her daughter, and Dr. Khairullah's daughters and their godmother. You can see on the right, this is a picture of the first Western Baha'i pilgrims and pictured in the winter of 1898. And Dr. Khairullah proudly sitting in the center. And Lua Getzinger sits second from the right. So she's right there. And standing in the left is Robert Turner. So this gentleman and this beautiful lady are also two of the disciples of Abdul Baha, Mr. Robert Turner, first African-American Baha'i. So, and also first African-American Baha'i to go on pilgrimage. So these are, and as you all most likely know, the monument for Mr. Robert Turner is underway. So this is another incredible soul that we should also turn to, is the great Mr. Robert Turner. So we're going to also read more about his history coming up later on in another part, because the beloved guardian really focuses on honoring African Americans in Advent to Divine Justice. And so we're going to see Mr. Robert Turner coming up again. Okay, so that will be another treat. Okay, so moving on. This historic pilgrimage created an opportunity for the American believers to initiate direct contact and communication with His Holiness Abdul Baha and to learn from him about the verities of this faith. So this is very, very important. Why is this moment very important? It's because now this gentleman was not the sole individual that was giving off the teachings to the American Baha'i community. There was others that were now hearing it from the source. Miss Lua Getzinger was now hearing it. There was Miss Apperson was hearing it. Miss Thornborough was hearing it. Dr. Getzinger was hearing it from Abdul Baha, and they were now hearing it from the source. And they were hearing his direct contact and communication with Abdul Baha. And these individuals, for the first time, suddenly realized that this curriculum that was being taught by Dr. Khairullah was not a true representation of the Baha'i scriptures. This is 1898, just coming. And many of his ideas contradicted the concepts enshrined in the writings of Baha'u'llah. So here's a picture of some Baha'is in Haifa, and with Ibrahim Khairullah. He's sitting right there. And there is also Mishrin Ghalam. He's a disciple of Baha'u'llah. So he's the great calligrapher, Mishrin Ghalam. So this resulted in a crisis. Now there is this, where a crisis, complete crisis up here. You don't know what to believe. You've just gone to the source, and this crisis created this unity in the community. So this crisis was huge. And as soon as the believers returned from the Holy Land in December 1899, contrary to what the pilgrims had discovered, now Khairullah insisted that his teachings represented Orthodox Baha'i belief and were correct. The others that had been on pilgrimage, they denied his claim and asserted that the friends should turn to Abdul Baha for guidance. After 2 years, in 1900, Dr. Khairullah decided to break away from Abdul Baha and to start his own sect. Only a small portion of the American Baha'is followed him. However, the disunity affected around half of the American believers who became alienated and left the faith. You see what this schism, what this defection of prominent individuals did. So now half the community became alienated and left the faith. The community was already negligible in size, without material means, but because of this defection of a prominent believer, it created such disunity, such problems, and half the community even left. This is from
Ehsan, I'm just
please.
I was just gonna jump in. Negligible in size, but I thought there were 50 million Baha'is.
If you believe the publication at that time, yes.
It just makes me wonder then, like, does that mean there were even less? It also mentioned 300.
That's right.
So if their accounting was so wrong, and maybe it was easier for them to verify the 300 though, as opposed to international numbers, right?
I'm sure.
So,
I'm sure. I would believe closer to the 300. And also there's other sources. I trust Robert Stockman's analysis of the early American Baha'i community over this publication in the Chicago. And the numbers that he cites are closer into the thousands at that point in time, 1899. So it was closer to about 1,500 around that period. So in the entire Baha'i community. So yeah, but some communities had 30, 40, 50 Baha'is. So yeah, it was, and And also what they may be saying as 300, it might be circle of friends attracted to the classes and not actually, Baha'is per se. And also remember that their understanding was a very limited scale. They may be attracted by the so-called secret organization. And so that was all this aspect of mystery and cultishness. That's why it was attracting them to the classes, and not the actual per se teachings, because he really wasn't giving them the teachings. He was giving them his own distortion. So yeah. Excellent, dear Jeremiah. So this is the beloved guardian in God Passes By, and he wants to really hit home this crisis that at that point in time. So this is from the beloved guardian. He refers to this episode in the early years of the ministry of Abdul Baha as a devastating crisis, which the ambition of Dr. Khairullah had upon his return from the Holy Land precipitated the agitation which he, who working in collaboration with the archbreaker of the covenant, that's Mirza Muhammad Ali, and his messengers had provoked the attacks launched by him and his fellow seceders, as well as by Christian ecclesiastics increasingly jealous of the rising power and extending influence of the faith. So he used this opportunity to try to elevate himself, and he allied himself with Mirza Muhammad Ali, the archbreaker of the covenant, and to try to take the America for himself. That's what he tried to do. So one of the messengers mentioned in Shoghi Effendi's statement was Shoallah. This is Mirza Muhammad Ali's son, who traveled to the United States to specifically meet Dr. Khairullah. So this was the son of Mirza Muhammad Ali, and this is Shoallah here. This is when he was about 60 years old. He was sent by the covenant breaker to literally try to assist Dr. Khairullah in his efforts. The beloved guardian Shoghi Effendi denounces Khairullah as the greedy and conceited Ibrahim Khairullah, who had chosen to uphold the banner of his rebellion in America for no less than 20 years, and who had the temerity to denounce in writing Abdul Baha, his false teachings, his misrepresentations of Baha'ism, his dissimulation, and to stigmatize his visit to America as a death blow to the cause of God. So you can read this in God Passes By. So this is what he created. He created this enormous crisis. And this is really per se the first person to come to America, the first teacher to come to America to teach the cause. And you can see, because Anton Haddad obviously was also one of the first people, but he really didn't make an impact compared to Ibrahim Khairullah, because he left in 1894 to go to that Antwerp convention. But Khairullah stuck around. And
so did Khairullah stick around? I mean, did he do it at any point because of his belief in the faith, or just strictly as a way to try to gain power? I mean, in the end, it looks like that, but it's like...
It was power. It was power and money. And we can read that in Stockman's article in World Order. It was power and money. He saw it as an opportunity because he failed in every business that he ventured into. And so when he did this spiritual healing, he saw that as an opportunity to make money. And so using his distortion of the faith, and also his charisma, he managed to attract people and making the faith into this mysterious cult kind of distortion. So he brought, and that aspect of mystery made people intrigued. What is this thing? And so obviously it got publications and people wanted to find out what is this thing. And so people came, and through his attraction, people ascribed to it. And I cannot be more amazed at people ascribing to this faith at that time, and then the incredible champions that also entered into the faith later and managed to overcome these obstacles. You see that this faith went through from the very start. One of the major obstacles of Shoghi Effendi from the beginning of his ministry was to develop the framework of the Baha'i administrative order based on the guidance provided by Baha'u'llah and Abdul Baha. And this was major cultural change that some Baha'is in North America did not find easy to accept. Hence, some of the believers drifted away, as reflected in the US Census, that reports of the Baha'is in 1926 was 1,247 compared to 2,884 in 1916. So you see, dropped by more than half. And this is now when the Beloved Guardian in 1926 was introducing this Baha'i administrative order. So this was another cultural change. You can see even when the House of Justice has been talking about the last 20 years, a culture of change, the institute process, a culture of change. And some of the friends massively champion it. And some friends per se drift away. And this is the reality of whenever there is change, people take sides. And this is what happened at that point in time too. When the center of the faith says, this is the standard, you arise. You don't challenge it. You don't bring in your 2 cents and say, this is that, and this is that, and I don't agree with this or that. And this is because every time the culture change, this is the test. That is the test. Are you obedient or are you not? And so you see, this is, and this is all in part in Mojan Momen's great article, A Change of Culture. So one of these other, this is this besotted lady. We mentioned her in America and the Most Great Peace, the besotted woman. That was the Beloved Guardian mentions in America and the Most Great Peace, Ruth White. There was also some opposition to the initiatives of the Beloved Guardian. For example, Ruth White in 1926 to 1929, she opposed the organizational changes pursued by Shoghi Effendi. She rejected the authority of Shoghi Effendi as the guardian of the faith appointed by Abdul Baha and claimed that the will and testament of Abdul Baha was a forgery. And we read about that besotted woman, Ruth White, in America and the Most Great Peace. And we read about her. Then there were other individuals. Mirza Ahmad Sohrab. Of all people, he was also Abdul Baha's secretary and interpreter. And Mrs. Julia Chandler. This is the lady that looks like a witch to me. I don't know if you've seen the movie The Witches, but she looks like a witch. Okay, that's wrong, but it's she does. Mrs. Julia Chandler set up the New History Society in New York in 1929 to indirectly teach the faith. They were told that they should operate within the Baha'i institutions, and local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of New York was to have an input into how the New History Society promoted the faith. Sohrab and Chandler declined to work with the New York Assembly, and this resulted in a confrontation with the National Spiritual Assembly and their eventual expulsion from the Baha'i community. So these two individuals openly challenged the National Spiritual Assembly, and they were expelled from the community. So these were other famous defections that were going on. So Scott, could you read this extract? This is from the Beloved Guardian for us.
Sure. Get it a little larger. The universal crisis affecting mankind is, therefore, essentially spiritual in its causes. The spirit of the age, taken on the whole, is irreligious. Man's outlook on life is too crude and materialistic to enable him to elevate himself into the higher realm of the spirit. It is this condition, so sadly morbid, into which society has fallen, that religion seeks to improve and transform.
Thank you, dear Scott. Thank you. So here you can see this crisis is the crude and materialistic understanding of humanity, and that's the reason why these great faiths have come for this transformation of society. So these dark forces that the Beloved Guardian mentions in paragraph 16, corruption, ingrained prejudice, and moral laxity, we're going to explore them now. Corruption is the use of power in authority for illegitimate personal gain, either for private enrichment, referred to as extraction, or stay in power, known as power preservation. There are often connections between these two forms of corruption, particularly in major corruption scandals. Corruption can happen in many different contexts. Political corruption occurs at the highest levels of the political system. Administrative or bureaucratic corruption occurs at the legal implementation end of politics. Corruption can also be in the form of dishonesty in the conduct and business of the individual. Now, the corruption mentioned here, okay, in paragraph 16, okay? Let me scroll back, and I'm doing this so you all remember what this extract was. I'm sorry, I'm just going back. Here, okay, here we are. Subjected from its infancy to tests of extreme severity involving at times the defection of some of its most prominent members, having to contend ever since its inception and in an ever-increasing measure with the forces of corruption, of moral laxity, and ingrained prejudice. Such a community in less than half a century and unaided by any of its sister communities, whether in the East or West, has achieved these things. So these are the forces, right? Corruption, moral laxity, and ingrained prejudices. Sorry about that. I just wanted you to see it in the paragraph. But why I brought that back up is it's talking directly to the American Baha'i community, not talking about the corruption in the greater society. Granted, many of these slides, I will show you the corruption that afflicts the greater society, namely political corruption and all the different elements of political corruption. But what does corruption mean? Corruption means to take something and make it impure. So that's why the opposite of corruption would be chaste and holy life, right? So the counterbalance to this vice, this dark force that the Beloved Guardian is mentioning here, is a chaste and holy life to counterbalance corruption. So all the elements of corruption, anything against, if we're talking about all the wonderful qualities that outlie a chaste and holy life, to be honest, honesty and purity. So if your opposite of purity is spiritually unclean, here in corruption, the opposite of honesty, dishonesty. We've been corrupted. The inner life has been corrupted. So it's not just in the aspect of corruption in the political sphere, but it's a corruption internally, to become sullied, to become dirty, and that is corruption. And so any form of corruption in the inner life of your inner life, remember, keep your eye clean, your heart, purified, your hands faithful, all of these things. So, and your mind clean. One of the 5 elements of a chaste and holy life is clean-mindedness. And we're going to explore that. Clean-mindedness is one of the elements of a chaste and holy life. So if one of them is to be clean-mindedness, the opposite of that is corruption, unclean mind. So anything entering into here is, are you watching, are you absorbing things that are unclean? And the reality is that would create corruption, dirt, entering into the mind, into the heart. So this is corruption. So corruption is not just on the political sphere, but we're going to explore that because we're also looking at it from the greater society, how money has affected all of these things. The ancient Greeks understood corruption as a problem of moral decay and deviation from a healthy system of government. And in England during the 18th century, corruption was seen as the intrusion of the executive on the legislature by giving bribes of or offering a favor. There's so many different types of corruption in the greater society. Bribery, this is the giving or offering of a bribe. Extortion, the practice of obtaining something, particularly money, through force or the threat of force. You can see how lots of people say money is the root of all evil, but it's not. Money is a tool and it can be used for incredible and wonderful things. What you do with money is the most important thing here. Cronyism, the appointment of friends and associates to positions of authority without proper regard to their qualifications. Nepotism, the practice of favoring relatives or friends, particularly by giving them jobs. And you can see all these other forms of corruption. Distribution of favors or rewards, such as public office, jobs, contracts, subsidies, prestige by a patron to a client. This is patronage politics. Influence peddling, the illegal practice of using one's influence in government or connections with people in authority to obtain favors or preferential treatment for another, usually in return for money. Graft, dishonest use of political authority for personal gain. And embezzlement, theft or misappropriation of funds placed in one's trust or belonging to one's employer. And you can see, dear friends, how every single one of these is commonplace in our political spheres in our country. And often they go under different names to protect them from, this is not bribery. This is, and I will explore all of that. That's actually very interesting. It's not bribery. We're using lobbyists. We're using people to move money, shift money around, but it's really not bribery. And we'll explore that and how corruption has become commonplace in our political world in our country. And this is at the greater society. But the aspect that here the beloved guardian is mentioning corruption, these aspects of all these problems of dishonesty and all the elements of vices, impurities, in saying that this level of corruption has entered into the community life and we need to purify ourselves from it. And I'm not talking about all the levels of political corruption. Hopefully that's not entered into the community of the Most Great Name. But I'm just sharing this because this is also corruption also. And lastly is gerrymandering, which is another terrible practice of corruption too. And this is quite pervasive in the United States. This is the practice since the founding of the country of allowing state politicians to set boundaries of their electoral districts. and often by incumbent political party to strengthen or weaken the power of a political party or even a racial group. And the courts have attempted with limited success to set legal and political standards to prevent this rigging of election boundaries. But gerrymandering has been here since the beginning, and it's another form of political corruption. So there you are. Those are different types of political corruptions. And there's a great political scientist, and his name's Inge Edmundson, and he is part of, has written numerous articles on corruption. And this is what he wrote in Political Corruption, Anti-Corruption Resource Center. And this is what he wrote. He says, in the context to political accumulation and extraction, these are the different forms: bribes, commissions, fees taken from private sector businesses, undue extraction through taxation and customs, fraud and economic crime, politically created rent-seeking opportunities, politically created market favors, benefiting businesses owned by political elites, off-budget transfers, manipulated processes of privatization, and extorting party and campaign funding from the state, private sector, and voters. So these are just some of the many, many methods of corruption that political groups utilize. And then he says, on the other hand, corrupt means of power preservation consist of buying political support and majorities from other parties and politicians, co-optation and maintenance of patron-client networks, buying decisions from parliament, judiciary, control and oversight bodies, favoritism, and patronage in allocation of government resources, buying voters and votes, electoral fraud, use of public money for political campaigns, buying off the media and civil society. All this aspect of buying, it's all corruption. So in general, corruption, and in particular political corruption, has been dominant phenomenon in politics in nearly every country of the world throughout human history. And the beloved Guardian, however, highlights corruption in America because of its systemic and endemic nature, and its persistent influence on the American system of government, operation of corporations, and business and trade relationships. There are so many examples of corruption in the United States, so many. I just wanted to share one because of its, sadly, its humor. This is one example. Political corruption in the United States is old as the nation. For example, in 1829, Samuel Swartwout, the collector of the customs for the Port of New York, appointed by President Andrew Jackson, embezzled over $1 million in custom receipts. $1 million back then. That's a lot of money. I think it's at least 17 million after what is it called? Is it inflation? After inflation of money. So the value today of $1 million, probably closer to 17 million custom receipts. And he fled to Europe. Wherever corruption exists, there have been efforts to combat it through reforms. And the most important events and transformation in American history, such as the American Revolution, the development of democracy and the Civil War and period after that, Reconstruction, they have all been fraught with corruption and reform. He literally just put in a bundle of $1 million and hightailed it. And he was in newspapers and everything. And he just fled to Europe, this guy. So this is just a case, an example of corruption. And some aspects of political corruption, as described, have remained unchanged in the United States throughout the centuries. Greed, secrecy, conspiracy are the dominant forces in politics. Public office is exploited for private interest. The law is... Please.
Real quick, that's $30 million today. Just letting you know.
Yeah, it's a ridiculous sum. Yeah, exactly. I think, yeah, $30 million. Thank you, Jeremiah. I was thinking it was closer to 17. $30 million. It's a ridiculous amount of money he just, walked away with. So, yeah, public office is exploited for private interest. The law is searched for loopholes and political enemies are accused of corruption. On the other hand, some features of corruption have changed and practices that were acceptable in the past are now forbidden. And I found this political cartoon. I don't like delving into politics too much, but I found this political cartoon quite accurate. It says, this is the public. He says, "Hey, Mr. Government official, what's going on under there?" And he says, "Trust me, you don't need to know." It's the cloak of secrecy. So you can see the level of corruption, and you can see he's walking on the laws and there's all these feet under him. And so, yeah, there's a lot of things that we don't know that is going on behind the scenes. And this is an incredible amount of corruption. And there's another incredible writer. This is a writer called Lawrence Lessig. He writes on political and economics articles. And this is an article he wrote, "How Money Corrupts Congress." This is very important because for the future and how that as when we hopefully move away from lobbyists and move away from these type of campaigning fundings. This is what he writes. He says, "Political corruption is interwoven with American democracy to the extent that even some legal practices in US politics can be considered as corrupt." So they're legal, but based upon the definition of corruption, he is saying these legal practices are corrupt. And so this is what this Harvard law professor states. Lawrence Lessig, he describes how special interest money systemically corrupts American politics. The members of the United States Congress are heavily dependent on funding from large donors for their political survival. Lessig argues that such a practice, though legal, it's illegal in the United States, is a systemic problem and a form of corruption. The members of Congress, this is so interesting. The members of Congress spend 3 of every 5 weekdays, so 60% of the time, 60% of a congressman's time, in raising money for re-election. So where is their mind? Where is their heart? They're only thinking of getting money. So they're not really thinking about the voters. They're only thinking to the whoever is providing the money. In this process, the members take up less than important issues in order to intimidate corporations and to force them to become campaign contributors. The complexity of the tax system and various special exceptions encourage this practice. So here it is. This is a very simple graphic showing the loophole, the loophole in getting away from corruption. Lobbying is an American word for legalized bribery. A politician in America, no wonder the country is corrupt to its core. The system goes like this. It is illegal if a special interest group provides money directly to a politician. Illegal. You can't do that. But if a special interest group provides money to a lobbyist and the lobbyist provides the same money to a politician, that's legal. Make sense? And this is the corruption that goes on in the United States. And that's just quite a very simple graphic to show how this is called legalized bribery in the United States. And here's another graphic depiction of how the countries in the West have been profiteering off the other countries and continents around the world. So this is also another aspect of corruption. And this is a very powerful graphic showing that we're also going to be talking about the conquests and the when we talk about the section on race and how different countries have been domineering over other areas in the world. So let's get into moral laxity. It was another one of those dark forces that the beloved guardian mentioned. So we talked about corruption, now moral laxity. So there was an incredible guy, his name was Alexis de Tocqueville. I'm terrible in my French. He was a French statesman, historian, and social philosopher. This is what he wrote. This is quite humorous to me. And he wrote this 1841, okay? He says, in the United States, the sovereign authority is religious. There is no country in the whole world in which the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. And there can be no greater proof of its utility and of its conformity to human nature than that its influence is most powerfully felt over the most enlightened and free nation of the earth. So he said this country, he even understood this country as being the most enlightened and free nation of the earth, the most spiritual nation, and there is no country in the whole world in which this Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. This is 1840s, okay? Such an observation, however, lost its validity as the 20th century unfolded. The dramatic changes that occurred in the United States after World War I undermined the role of Christianity in the society and its moral influence on the people. Before the 1920s, values and morality were respected, and everyone was expected to live by them. Women were trained to be sophisticated and reserved. There was no smoking or drinking permitted in public. The family was the critical unit in an early American society and comprised the husband, wife, biological children, and extended family. Divorce was rare. It was generally illegal to live together or have children outside of marriage. And in the early 19th century, the family gained more importance as a source of happiness, but its nature started to change. This is very interesting and very important. Common law marriage became an acceptable form of union. Companionate marriage, in which couples consented to have no children, and divorce by mutual consent with no financial or economic claim on each other, became widespread. This resulted in a rapid tripling of the divorce rate between 1860 and 1910. So in the 1920s, Christian values and morality started to be replaced by a new morality under a social liberalism, emphasizing freedom and equality for everyone. These changes were particularly pronounced in the metropolitan areas of northern and western United States. Liberalism. This is what liberalism is. Liberalism, a political or social philosophy advocating the freedom of the individual, parliamentary systems of government, nonviolent modification of political, social, or economic institutions to assure unrestricted development in all spheres of human endeavor and governmental guarantees of individual rights and civil liberties. So they wanted their absolute unrestricted development in all spheres of their life. absolute freedom. So these concepts were promoted of liberalism are generally positive and progressive and can significantly advance the society. However, like any ideology, when it is not pursued holistically, and in particular, when some of its elements are taken to an extreme, it can become a source of harm. The liberalist movement in the United States in this period was also a reactionist movement to the fundamentalism that started among conservative Presbyterian theologians at Princeton Theological Seminary in the 19th century and spread to conservatives in Baptist and other denominations in 1920 to 1930. So this extreme liberalism that was up in the Northwest was a reactionary movement to the Presbyterians, theologians that were at Princeton Theological Seminary in the 19th century. And so this is the theological seminary where they were being, I guess, very fundamentalist and caused this reactionary liberalist movement that took off in the United States. Social liberalism.
Did you know that prohibition was during those exact years?
Exactly. And that was also a period of more reactionary. So
do you think that accelerated this more laxity?
I do.
The act of saying banning it was what caused it to like double down, kind of.
Absolutely, yeah. Because the government cannot dictate the spiritual life of individuals. So if you have not matured in your understanding of the harmful and effects of alcohol and saying you cannot have it, what does it do? It's just like if I want a Coca-Cola, I go to a Coke machine, and I have the money for the Coke, and I put my money into the Coke machine, but the Coke machine doesn't give me my Coca-Cola. I'm like, what? I have the money for my Coke and the Coke machine is denying me. So what am I going to do? I'm going to shake the Coke machine. I start getting angrier. I shake the Coke machine. I kick the Coke machine. I do everything. So that actually what happens is the denying of the behavior of alcohol, the prohibition, actually amplified the bad behavior. So they are in the 1920s, wherever, during this period when prohibition was going on, they tried to do everything to go around it. And the bootlegging and all these other type of activities really amplified during this period. Social liberalism gave rise to envy and greed amongst the lower classes of society. And hence many Americans went into debt to buy consumer goods such as cars, radios, and home appliances. This is another new phenomenon during this period. This idea of massive envy and greed that wasn't as much around as it was amplified during this period. This heightened sense of greed, heightened sense of envy. Its impact was also on sexuality was quite observable. Prior to the 1920s, Protestant values of chastity and modesty dominated American culture. Sexual relationships outside of traditional marriage were regarded as immoral and vile. Here's an interesting clippings I put on the left. You can see on the left side and on the right side. Car sales, the number of general motor cars sold, 1910, 39,300. 1924, 587,341. Do you think they all had the money for those cars? All credit. So now they're all buying on credit, money they didn't have. So remember, the stock market crash comes, these people gone, right? So you could see how much these people are based upon envy and greed that is in society. Cars on credit, number of cars, trucks bought from 1919 on credit. So total 1,147,808. So it's equivalent of $810 million was bought on credit at that time, which is, I don't need dear Jeremiah to go and calculate that after, what is $810 million at 1910. I can tell you that's an incredible amount of money that was poured on credit, given to General Motors on cars. And also the amount of immorality that the looseness of and laxity of moral character that was going on during this period of time was also on a scale that had never been done before. And even if it had been done, it was done behind closed doors. It wasn't in the open, as they say. But now it was out and about. So this social liberalism, as mentioned, it gave rise to envy and greed. So in the 1920s, these concepts about sexuality, it underwent this radical change. People became more receptive to explicit sexual behavior outside of marriage, as promoted by motion pictures, plays, songs, novels, advertising. A new generation of women in the 1920s, they were known as the flappers. I don't know if you're well knowledgeable about this period. It's a very interesting period of time. These ladies were called flappers. They were considered stylish. They smoked and they drank in public. They dressed provocatively, revealingly, and sought independence and other social freedoms. These young women not only embraced their sexuality, but often publicly displayed it. So the dress, the attire, seeing the, women dressed in fashion shows, in the news clipping, like this, was never appropriate before. This was not acceptable, and now it was commonplace in magazines, in print, in movies. Interestingly, I came across in Abdul Baha in Egypt, and someone asked His Holiness Abdul Baha, "What do you think of the dress and attire of women?" And remember, this is 1914, 1915, around when Abdul Baha was in Egypt. So someone actually asked that question. And here we go. This is the correspondent. "What do you think about women's fashions?" Abdul Baha: "We do not look upon the dresses of women." I find it quite humorous. Someone actually asked about women's fashions to Abdul Baha. "Whether they are of the latest mode, we are not the judge of fashion. We consider rather the wearer of the dress. If she is chaste, if she is pure, if she is cultured, if she is characterized with heavenly morality, and if she is favored at the threshold of God, she is honored and respected by us. No matter what manner of dress she wears, we have nothing to do with the ever-changing world of mode and picture hats." So Abdul Baha is saying it doesn't matter the outer attire, it matters the inner attire. What is your inner attire? Is it clothed with the raiment of the love of Baha'u'llah? Is it clothed with the virtues? Is it clothed, with all those ornaments of equity and honesty and truthfulness? He says, I don't care about the outer attire, but he says, is your inner attire chaste? Is your inner attire pure? And if she is characterized with heavenly morality. So then we move to moral laxity, the third, I think this is actually, this is still moral laxity, sorry. So moral laxity has continued to affect more Americans in decades that followed and intensified its negative impact on the fabric of American society to the extent that the beloved guardian has considered it as one of the negative forces hampering the progress of the North American Baha'i community. So this is considered one of these negative forces that is hampering the progress of this community. Now we go to the third problem, ingrained prejudice that the beloved guardian mentions, these three dark forces. And I'm just going to start from the American Civil War. This ingrained prejudice has been here since the very start of this country, but I'm going to start from the Civil War. The American Civil War of 1861 to 1865 was fought over two fundamental issues that had not been resolved during this American Revolution. The Northern victory in the war ensured the unity of the United States as one nation and legally ended the institution of slavery through the 13th Amendment. In the South, African Americans found a new life after slavery, free from brutality and indignities they experienced during slavery. However, prejudice and discrimination against African Americans persisted. An awesome documentary on Netflix is the 13th, in regards to the 13th Amendment. I encourage everyone to watch it. And it's about this loophole in the 13th Amendment that because after the Emancipation Proclamation that was given by Abraham Lincoln, the great historic Emancipation Proclamation, which we're going to study in part 14 of our study. This incredible Emancipation Proclamation that freed millions of enslaved individuals in this country. There was a 13th Amendment. And this 13th Amendment came in the Constitution. And this 13th Amendment said that if you were a prisoner or had committed a crime, if you had committed a crime, your rights, you do not have the right to freedoms if you were a prisoner or had committed a crime. So what happened was, this gave the South justification to unfairly put as many African Americans into prisons as they could. And so what happened is, this is what they did. They put as many African Americans into work camps as they could. And these, because when slavery ended, all their fields were empty. They had to have someone to work them. So now they had legal justification to have free workforce, these prison work camps. And actually, where I live in Sugarland, Texas, that's called Sugarland because it was a former sugar plantation. And I live on the land that was a former prison land here in Texas. And so that was where the prison workforce was working the lands in my area in Sugarland, Texas. Isn't that crazy? So you see how, it hits home, and this is the reality. So this ingrained prejudice, the Southern state governments legislated these black codes. And this is something, dear friends, as Baha'is, we should study this history, know this history. And we're going to get into it much more as the course progresses. But I want you to endeavor in studying this history, as this is part and parcel of not only our American history, but if we are to champion racial justice, we should become well-versed in African American history. So these black codes, the Southern state governments legislated to give the African American the right to marry, own property, and sue in court. They removed all of that. However, the colored people could not serve on juries, testify against whites, or serve in state militias. Most Southern African Americans lived in extreme poverty, and they were forced to rent land from the previous white slave owners, and a portion of their crops were given to the landowner as rent. So remember, African Americans just coming out of slavery, right? Just coming out of slavery. They're not considered human at this point. Just emerging out of slavery, even though Emancipation Proclamation just come in, now the South has already declared black codes. They don't have any rights. Again, rights have been removed, even though they were given, per se, the freedom. You're now free. But nope, black codes came in. Now you don't have any rights. You can't do anything. You can't testify against whites. You can't serve in state militias. You can't or have any form of organization. And you have no rights to marry or own property or sue in court. In essence, you don't have any rights. Literally just coming out of being enslaved. So what happens is, right after that is the same as as I mentioned, that 13th Amendment was utilized to literally put them all into the prison system. And this massive industrialized prison system that we have in the United States is because of the 13th Amendment. And that's why more than 50% of the inhabitants of our prison industrial complex are African Americans, when they only are less around 10% of the population. Why is there inhabiting over 50%? And this is straight up racism. It's institutionalized racism. It was planned, it was coordinated, systematized. And so this is, and you can see it real well. I don't do the documentary any form of justice, and I encourage everyone to watch 13th. It's on Netflix if you have Netflix. And so that is something really educational to increase your understanding of what has been going on. And so you see the history of ingrained prejudice in our country. During the Reconstruction era, so now from the point of Emancipation Proclamation all the way through 1877, Reconstruction, Congress passed laws to promote civil and political rights of African Americans across the South. This was an incredible time. Now Congress is actually providing laws for the protection of civil rights and political rights African Americans. This is called Reconstruction. The opportunities provided were welcomed by African Americans, and as a result, 700 African American men served in elected public office, and 2 were elected as state senators, and 14 became members of the House of Representatives, and 1,300 African American men and women held government jobs. This was unbelievable. And if you just think, right before here, they were considered less than cattle. Okay? Now they're serving in the highest offices in their land and considered and serving in Congresses, and the United States government is enacting laws for their protection. This was unbelievable. And this picture here is the first colored senator and representatives. So this was a major, per se, victory. But with every victory comes the countervailing processes at work. So what happened? A hate group against Reconstruction called the Ku Klux Klan. This was the countervailing process that was at work. The first movement emerged in Pulaski, Tennessee, 1866. So 1865, remember? Emancipation Proclamation. 1866, Ku Klux Klan emerged in Pulaski, Tennessee, 1866. The KKK members demanded the restoration of white supremacy through violence and intimidation against African Americans. White supremacy is a racist ideology that claims white people are the dominant race. This is also, dear friends, we're going to explore in detail. And when I say detail, we're going in detail where this ideology emerged from, okay? And that's coming up in part 14. And that's going to be very interesting. So white supremacy is this racist ideology that claims white people are the dominant race. And supremacy groups in the world vary according to whom they envisage to be white and which racial groups are considered as the primary enemy. And under pressure from the federal government, this was very interesting too. Under pressure from the federal government, the Ku Klux Klan started to disappear, particularly when their objectives were achieved in the 1870s. So under pressure from the federal government, this first movement almost disappeared. But what happened? What happened? Does racism end there? Is the story of racism over? No. Then from the late 1870s, Southern states passed laws to segregate whites from persons of color. So this is now 1870s. This is, and in public transportation, schools, parks, cemeteries, theaters, restaurants. They called them persons of color. I called them before that, this appellation. Before they had called them Negroes or even worse. And this is now the persons of color refer to anyone with a degree of Black ancestry. And these laws were known as the Jim Crow laws. They were enforced until 1954. So all the way from 1870s to 1954, it was a period of Jim Crow laws. And eventually, when the Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional, this separation of based upon this color of the skin. This period of racial prejudice is, during this, let me be very clear, really, apart from the effects of racism in, emotionally hurting and damaging, but it was financially an economic catastrophe against the African Americans in America. It was a massive economic catastrophe. Even though they were declared emancipated under the Emancipation Proclamation, but because of all of these continued one after another, now the states are declaring separation. Now that the states are, redlining, the states are doing one after another Jim Crow laws and, black codes and all of these, one after another, it caused them to be so financially hurt. And under the Great Depression in the 1920s, everybody lost their job. But if a white person lost their job and the Black person lost their job, and if you only had a job for one of those, who do you think they would hire? They would hire the whites. So the Blacks predominantly did not have a job during that period of time. They lost all their farms. They lost everything. It was a massive, massive, massive compounding problem of racism throughout the United States at that period of time. So racial prejudice and animosity towards those who were not considered as real Americans. Now, this is very important, dear friends. African Americans, since coming to the United States, have tried to prove that they are real Americans. They are real Americans. No one else has had to do this. No, on the scale that African Americans have had to do it. Asian Americans, such as Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans, at different points, yes, they've had to also to contend with showing that they're real Americans, and other groups have had too. But the reality is not on the scale that African Americans have had to deal with this over hundreds of years. The majority of African Americans did not benefit from the economic prosperity of the 1920s. It was such an incredible flourishing, as you saw. People were becoming rich left, right, and center during the 1920s and 30s. African Americans did not, because they were deprived from owning property, owning lands, deprived from owning anything. They did not have access to banks. They did not have access, and they just came out of slavery, and they were also did not get any reparations, even though there were ideals of 40 acres and a mule, but that was stripped from them. So there was no reparations. So coming right out of slavery, these peoples had nothing. And then the country was doing well economically, but they did not benefit. So what happened is, with this industrial development and the emergence of manufacturing and jobs, there was a mass migration of African Americans moving out from the South, because the South obviously was the epicenter of racism. Not that the rest of the United States wasn't racist, but when I say epicenter, that really was per se the heart of many massacres and atrocities. So they wanted to get out of there. And they saw opportunities in industrial cities such as New York, Chicago, Detroit, and others. So they moved. This was a mass migration. It was called the Great Migration. And this happened during the 1920s. Now, many Iranian Americans, also, Iranian American Bahá'ís, this is how also, as a Persian American Bahá'í, can have that feeling of connection to our African American brothers and sisters. Persian American Bahá'ís en masse have immigrated out of their land due to persecution. African American brothers and sisters, just a few generations ago, also were forced immigrants out because of persecution. And so this is another tie, a connection that these great souls are, in the sense of, these are our spiritual descendants too. These are our African American brothers and sisters that were forced to flee. And they were forced to set up ghettos throughout these areas because they didn't have anything else. So these were Black neighborhoods that were considered ghettos. Again, this Ku Klux Klan reemerged. This is again this countervailing process. Whenever, this is something very important, my dear friends. Whenever the standard of racial justice emerges, there will be a countervailing process to come and try to attack it. Whenever the light emerges, the darkness tries to come and attack it. And this is, again, now the African Americans are appearing in different areas. They're taking jobs, and they're now having their own ghettos in the sense of their own neighborhoods. Now, again, in 1915, the Ku Klux Klan reemerges. This is the second movement. And it was really the inspiration of D.W. Silent film, The Birth of a Nation, D.W. Griffith's movie, The Birth of a Nation. It's on YouTube if you want to watch it. It mythologized the founding of the first Klan. And it was really Woodrow Wilson, the president, who viewed it in the White House. It was the first movie viewing in the White House. And he was one of the promoters of this movie. And his quote is in the movie, in the sense of, because he per se was not an official member of the Ku Klux Klan, but he was a promoter of segregation. He was a promoter of really injustices against African Americans, and that's very well documented. Okay, so I'm not just, but we're going to talk more on Woodrow Wilson, and because in Advent to Divine Justice, he's mentioned in Advent to Divine Justice, and later on in two different places, Woodrow Wilson is mentioned. So the Ku Klux Klan movement extended its campaign to include discrimination against Roman Catholics, Jews, and Mexicans at a time of high emigration from the mostly Catholic nations of Central and Southern Europe. And its membership increased to over 100,000 in 1921 to 5 million by the mid-1920s, but it started later to decrease during the late 1920s. So you could see, and this is when they did their March on Washington. So the Ku Klux Klan was well supported, well funded, and became pervasive in American society. We're going to talk much more greater detail on the history of race in a later part, but I just wanted to touch on this ingrained prejudice in this section because it was mentioned in paragraph 16. And in this part, we have given just a brief background why the beloved guardian refers to ingrained prejudice as one of the maladies. Maladies means sicknesses. This is a sickness that this country is afflicted with, affecting the North American society. And there is strong evidence indicating that racial prejudice has continued to be prevalent in American society, in spite of strict anti-discrimination legislations. I always find that humorous, that legislations don't do anything. I mean, we've had laws, trying to protect people, and we are all one, in America. In fact, we are all equal. I mean, that's we the people. It's been part of the Constitution. But when they wrote "we the people," they were not meaning African Americans when they wrote "we the people." In fact, if you look around who was writing the Constitution, there weren't any African Americans. So it was literally "we the people," meaning we the white people. So yeah, that will be explored much more. So yeah, racial segregation in American cities, the biased negative attitudes of whites towards other ethnic and racial groups, social separation, isolation of racial groups, many other factors demonstrate that prejudice is deeply entrenched in American society and in the minds of many of its citizens. Racism is one of those things that unless you dwell and delve into your inner heart, you may not even know that you have it. You gotta sometimes meta think. You gotta think about thinking about what is going on in your mind and in your heart to even think about, am I racist? And then you have to even think of situations and think about, how would I handle this situation, and think about roles and how, and if you have even a racist thought, a racist ideology, how can you fight it? How can you eradicate it? In the words of the beloved guardian, how could you uproot it? How could you try in every way to eliminate those thoughts? And this is my own picture here. These forces of corruption, racism, moral laxity, and materialism are the forces that are really one after another, just constantly hammering our country. So there we are, dear friends. That was our deep analysis of paragraph 16, early history of our American Baha'i community, the dark forces that are afflicting our American Baha'i community, namely corruption, ingrained prejudice, and moral laxity. And then we're going to get into our next session next week. Thank you so much, as always. Do you have any questions, Jeremiah, from anyone, or thoughts before we can close for today?
We just have a comment from Linda talking about how sad our history is. So appreciate it.
Awesome. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. And so I'll go ahead and share the screen and then say the prayer, and we'll close it out for the day.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Thank you.
Oh my God, thou seest me in my lowliness and weakness, occupied with the greatest undertaking, determined to raise thy word among the masses and to spread thy teachings among thy peoples. How can I succeed unless thou assist me with the breath of the Holy Spirit? Help me to triumph by the hosts of thy glorious kingdom, and shower upon me thy confirmations, which alone can change a gnat into an eagle, a drop of water into rivers and seas, and an atom into lights and suns. O my Lord, assist me with thy triumphant and effective might, so that my tongue may utter thy praises and attributes among all people, and my soul overflow with wine of thy love and knowledge. Thou art the omnipotent and the doer of whatsoever thou willest. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jeremiah. Have a wonderful week.
You too. Bye.